Hey guys, welcome to another video from the Forum for Learning, and specifically welcome to Lecture 1, Part 1 of the Biology 101 series of videos. In this video, we're going to try and answer these two questions here. So number one, what is biology? And number two, what constitutes life? And so Lecture 1, both part 1 and part 2, we're just gonna attempt to kind of give you guys an overview of biology, like, so what is biology, and sort of how is biology organized, and just a general overview of what's to come in the following lectures. All right, so without further ado, let's get started. So like we said before, number one, what is biology? Right? So if we take the word biology apart, right, into its prefix and suffix, so the prefix being bio and the suffix being ology, and we define these two, we'll get a better idea as to what biology is. So bio simply just means life, right? And ology simply just means the study of, right? So for example, astrology or theology, right? So all of these ologies are just the study of. So what is biology? So based on just the definitions of the prefix and suffix of the word, it's simply the study of life, right? So that's essentially what biology is. And so, okay, so our next question is, if biology is the study of life, well then, what constitutes life, right? So what is life? Well, let's answer that. So what constitutes life, right? So, and this seems like a kind of a, I guess, so it's difficult to define it in that sense, right? So what constitutes life? But for example, if we say, a flower versus a rock, right? It's easy to say, oh yeah, the flower will be considered life, whereas the rock is non-living, right? Or not life, living, right? Oops. Okay, well, things are not always that easy, right? It's not always that easy to distinguish between something that's living and something that's non-living. So for example, bacteria versus viruses, right? Here, well, bacteria are considered living things, whereas viruses are considered non-living. And so here that distinction is a bit harder to draw, right? So again, we ask ourselves what constitutes life. And so biologists have sort of, pondered this for, many years, and what they've come up with is that they state that well, the answer to this anyway, or like the closest we're going to get to it, is that all living things share 8 characteristics. 8 characteristics / functions. So in other words, in order to be considered living, right, just like bacteria is considered living, or flower is considered to be living, so in order to be considered living, it has to have or possess these 8 characteristics or functions. So what are they? Well, let's go through them. So number one is order. So what we'll do is we'll just list them first, and then we'll discuss each of them, so that we spend enough time talking about each of those, each of these characteristics. So number two is the ability to sense and respond to stimuli. Number 3 is the ability to maintain homeostasis. Number 4 is the ability to harness energy. Number 5 is the ability to grow and develop. Number 6 is the ability to reproduce. Number 7 is the ability to evolve. Number 8 is the ability to adapt. Okay, so these are sort of the 8 characteristics that all living things share. All right, so now if you look at these 8, you'll see that the first 5 of these characteristics or functions aid in individual survival, right? Meaning they aid in the survival of a single unit, so a single person or a single organism, right? So for example, the ability to harness energy, right? In order for us to survive, harnessing energy aids in the survival of the individual. Whereas if you look at these 3 guys here, these 3 characteristics aid in species survival. Right? So, and that's sort of how we'll organize part 1 and part 2 of lecture 1. So in the first part, so in this video, we'll cover the first 5 of the characteristics that all living things share. So this is going to be part 1, and then we'll talk about the remaining 3 in part 2. Okay, so let's get started with the first part, or the first 5. All right, so let's talk about number 1, order. So what do we mean by order, right? So when we talk about order, we mean that all living things have some form of organizational structure. Right, so which means kind of they have some sort of order with which they're organized, they're built, right? So for example, let's look at us, right? Let's look at humans, right? So we are multicellular, right? We're multicellular creatures. So let's look at how we are structured, or the organizational structure that we have as multicellular creatures. Oh wait, actually, let's finish. So yeah, order. Just when we talk about order, we mean that all living things have some form of organizational structure or order, consisting of, I forgot to mention this, consisting of one or more cells. Okay, and that's why I mentioned we're multicellular. So we're talking about the organisms that have more than one cell. So let's look at our organizational structure, right? So first we have the individual. So we have the human being. Right now, actually, let's do individual, because this also applies to other multicellular creatures. So we have the individual, which in this case is our human, right? So like you or I. And then if we can break the individual, we can break the human down into organ systems, right? So for example, we have the digestive system, right? And the organ systems are made up of organs. So multiple organs, they coordinate together to form the organ systems of the human body. And so, for example, an organ would be the liver, the pancreas, and so on and so forth, right? And then these organs are made up of what are called tissues. So, for example, we have epithelial tissue, you could have connective tissue, and so on, right? And then these tissues, you can break these tissues down into cells, right? So different cells. So you have like the neurons, which are your brain cells, you have your hepatocytes, which are your liver cells, and then so on and so forth. And so, as you can see, to get from the cell to the individual, there's a whole lot of organized structure, right? It doesn't just go cell to individual, it goes cell, then to tissues, then to organs, and then organ systems, and then finally we make up the individual. So you can see that there's a great deal of a structure when it comes to human beings, right? And this is the case for all living things. Now, all living things aren't going to have, this level of structure, right? This complex of a structure, but all living things will have some form of organizational structure, either consisting of one or more than one cell. So let's look at an example of a unicellular organism and how a unicellular organism is structured, right? So for example, if we look at bacteria, so bacteria are an example of unicellular creatures. So let's put that in parentheses, right? So here, we start with the cell, right? The cell is the biggest component, or the cell is the individual, right? So here, let's do that actually. So the individual here is a cell, because for unicellular organisms, you only have one cell, right? So the cell is the whole organism. So, well, okay, well, actually, let's write it the other way, because the cell is the individual, right? So now the cell can be broken down into organelles, right? And this is kind of similar to organ systems in that there's compartmentalization of structure and of function, right? So for the organ systems, for example, the digestive system takes care of digestion, right? It's not. I mean, of course, they're all tied in, but it's not responsible for, say, getting oxygen into the blood, right? That's the task of the cardiovascular system, and the pulmonary system, right? So you can see that there's compartmentalization of labor or of function, right? And the same thing goes for organelles in unicellular individuals. So for example, organelles, like we have mitochondria, right? Which is responsible for producing the energy that the cell needs, right? The other organelles don't do that, right? So, and then you have, for example, ribosomes, which are tasked with protein production, right? So you can see that even though we're looking at it from a much smaller perspective, right, you still have a great deal of organization, and very similar in terms of organizational structure, because you have, again, compartmentalization. Just like the organ systems of the human body, the organelles, the cells, also help compartmentalize function and labor, right? So now if you break down the organelles even further, we have what are known as macromolecules. So these are your proteins, your lipids, and your carbohydrates. Okay, then these macromolecules, so these are large organic molecules, right? So when you break down these large organic molecules, you'll end up with what are known as monomers. And monomers are just individual units of, or individual building blocks of these macromolecules, right? So you have the monomers, and so for example, so for proteins, if you break down proteins, you get what are known as amino acids. For lipids, those are fatty acids. And then for carbohydrates, that are known as monosaccharides. Right? Then if you break down the monomers, we end up with individual atoms. Right? Like carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and so on and so forth, right? Oops. So, as you can see, even within a unicellular organism, you still have a tremendous amount of organizational structure, right? Because you have to go from the atoms, the monomers, the macromolecules, the organelles, and then finally you have the cell. And the other thing to keep in mind is that when we talk about a multicellular organism, right, we have, again, we go from the individual, and then you can break the individual down into organ systems. So the human being, you can break them down into the various organ systems, and the organs, tissues, and the cells. And then from here, you can break it down even further, right? Just like we did for the unicellular. So from the cell, you have the organelles, macromolecules, and then it keeps going on and on and on. So we're very complex creatures, and all living things have some some semblance of complexity and organizational structure. So that's very important. Now, the other two things that I want to mention real quick is that the cell, right here, which is our smallest kind of, well, you can break it down smaller, obviously, as we saw here, but the cell is actually the smallest form of life. And what I mean by that is it's the fundamental unit of life. Right? Now, that's very important because just like, so for example, monomers, right? If you build up the monomers, you get to macromolecules. Same thing with the cells are the building blocks of life, right? It's the fundamental unit of life. So that's very important. Now the other thing is atoms are the fundamental unit of matter. Oops. So there's a distinction there. So in order for it to be something to be considered living, it has to be made up of cells. But in order for something to be considered matter, it has to be made up of atoms, right? So that's the distinction between cell, which is, I guess, the smallest unit we're talking about with respect to this diagram here, and then versus the atom, which is the smallest unit in this diagram, in this diagram here, right? So that was just a distinction that I wanted to make. All right, so now we've covered order. So now let's go to number 2, which is the ability to sense and respond to stimuli or stimulus, right? And we'll go with stimuli. All right, so what do we mean by this? Well, the ability to sense and respond, right? Like we mentioned before, just like the other 5 or the other 4 that we'll mention, is that this ability or this characteristic or this function that all living things share aid in survival of the individual. right? And so with respect to us, or with respect to, all organisms, the ability to sense, right? The ability to sense where in our case are the senses, right? Gives us, or gives the organism, the ability, the ability to understand what's happening in its environment, right? So by sensing a stimulus, you're also sort of mapping out or figuring out what's going on in the surroundings or in the environment that you're in, right? And that's very important because it gives us a sense of what's happening outside of the organism, right? And by understanding the environment and what's going on in the environment, we're then able to respond, right? Or react to a stimulus. And this response can be either positive, so it can be a positive response, or it can be a negative response, right? And now what do we mean by that? Well, when we say it's a positive, so let's say you sense a stimulus, right? An organism senses a stimulus, and then it responds positively. That just means that it moves towards stimulus. And if it reacts negatively, it just means that it moves away. Right, towards the stimulus, and here it moves away from the stimulus. So let's talk about an example, right? We'll talk about an example. So again, with respect to humans, we'll talk about it with respect to humans and why disability is so important, and sort of just give an example of what we mean by this. So for example, let's say that one day you touch a hot pan, right? What usually happens? Well, you're gonna pull your hand away, right? If you touch something that's hot, you're likely going to pull hand away, right? So there's two things happening here. When we touch, this is where our senses come into play, right? So we sense the heat, right? And then what do? We pull away, and so we react or respond negatively, right? And it's very important that we do that for our own safety, right? So this again goes to show how the ability to sense and respond aids in the survival of the individual, right? It protects us, because if we come in contact with a stimulus that can be potentially harmful, like touching a hot pan, we can respond in a way that we can get away from it, and so that we don't actually end up getting hurt, and so the stimulus doesn't actually hurt us, right? So another example would be to look at something. So for example, other than human beings, so let's look at something like plants, right? So plants, if you've noticed, or what they do is they move towards the source of light. It's actually really cool. You guys could try it at home, where if you have any indoor plants, if you try and put them by like a windowsill, you can notice that they'll start to sort of grow towards where that sun is coming from, towards the window, like the outside of the window. It's actually really interesting. And so this shows us that they're able to sense it, right? Because in order for them to move towards the light, they have to be able to sense the light. So they can not only sense the source of light, but they also respond. They respond, in this case, they respond positively, right? Because they're moving towards the stimulus, which is the source of light. So that's just another example. Now, bacteria are also known to do this in what are called, let's draw a line here, in what are called, let's just do bacteria, what are known as chemotaxis. Chemotaxis and or phototaxis. And this is what happens when bacteria will move towards, so again, reacting positively, move towards a chemical source or light source, respectively. So hopefully that gives you guys a couple of examples of what we mean by having the ability to sense and respond to stimuli. Okay, so now let's look at the next one, which was, what did we say it was? We said that, so we did order, we just did the ability to sense and respond to stimuli, and now we're going to do the ability to maintain homeostasis. So, okay, so this is actually really important as well. Homeostasis. Okay. So again, this is another one of those characteristics or functions that aids in survival. Survival of the individual. Right. But let's first define what homeostasis is, right? So homeostasis is the maintenance of internal conditions within a narrow range, almost constantly. Right? Despite changes in external environment. So for example, some of the examples, so some of the things that our body tries to maintain, right, is temperature, pH, salinity, which is the salt concentration, blood sugar, right, and so on and so forth. Now, the purpose of homeostasis is to pretty much make sure that the cells within the body can function optimally, right? So that the conditions within the cell and within the body are conducive for optimal cellular activity, right? So that's pretty much what homeostasis is mainly for. It's to ensure that cells function optimally. So something that's very important, which we'll get to in the later lectures, are called enzymes, right? So enzymes, they're just proteins that are useful for metabolism, right? They're reaction catalysts, right? Metabolic reaction catalysts. And something about enzymes is that they require, so different enzymes, right? So different enzymes require their own set of conditions for optimal catalyzation of reactions. Right? So for example, a good example is pepsin, right? So pepsin is an enzyme that's found in the stomach, right? So enzyme that's found in the stomach. And what it does is it helps break down certain proteins in our diet, and it requires, so pepsin is very interesting because it's located in the stomach, and one of the main reasons why it's located in the stomach is because pepsin requires requires an acidic environment. So a really low pH, right? So low pH. So it's something like around 2, which is really acidic. And so pepsin will only function, or can only function optimally when the pH is around 2. And so that's just another example of why homeostasis is so important. So now let's look at one example of how our body, so again, this is with respect to humans, how our body maintains homeostasis with respect to temperature. And so this is known as thermoregulation, right? So what is thermoregulation? Well, it's just, again, it's homeostasis, which is the maintenance of internal conditions within a narrow range almost constantly despite changes in external temperature or external environment. But thermoregulation is with respect to temperature, so internal temperature, right? So internal temperature. So it's to regulate internal temperature. So our bodies are usually around 36.5 degrees to 37 degrees Celsius, right? That's the narrow range that our bodies aim to keep the body temperature at, right? So what happens when it dips below or when it goes up? So for example, let's say that you're in Alaska, right? In the middle of winter. So in the dead of winter, you're in Alaska. So it's really cold. So what's going to happen? Your body temperature is going to start dropping, right? It's going to start dropping below that 36.5 degree to 37 degree range. Actually, we don't want that, right? Because again, we have to maintain our body temperature within this specific range so that our cells can function properly, so that our enzymes can function properly, and so on and so forth. So how do we, what does the body do, right? So it attempts to increase the body temperature, right? To get it back to this range here. And so how do you do that? So first of all, what happens? Well, what happens when we get cold? We shiver, right? That's one of the things. Another thing that happens, which we don't really, we can't really feel ourselves, is something that happens really without our control, is vasoconstriction of the vessels, so blood vessels in the extremities. So what happens is that your blood vessels will close up. So your blood vessels in your feet and your hands will close up and get narrower and allow less blood to the extremities in order to preserve warm blood for your core, right? Because majority of heat exchange happens in your extremities, so the body tries to limit the amount of blood that goes to the extremities, so you try and limit the amount of heat that is being dissipated. And so by doing both, by shivering as well as vasoconstriction of the extremities, of the vessels in the extremities, what happens? Your body temperature starts to go back up to be within the proper range, right? And so this is just an example, one of the examples of thermoregulation. And so let's look at the opposite. So let's look at what happens if let's say we were in Death Valley in the dead of summer. Well, here our body temp is likely going to be greater than 37 degrees, right? So greater than that, than this range here, than this range right here. And so what's going to happen? Well, what's the common thing when we get too hot? We start to sweat, right? So your body starts producing sweat and attempts to cool you down through evaporative cooling. The other thing that happens is the opposite of vasoconstriction. You have vasodilation of the vessels in your extremities. And so this allows for greater heat exchange and so greater heat dissipation. And again, the result is the opposite in that your body temperature will drop and to be within the proper range. And the body has systems just like this for all of those conditions that we mentioned before, for pH, for salinity, for blood sugar, and then so on and so forth, right? So this is just one example with respect to temperature as to how we maintain homeostasis and why it's so important. Again, it's to ensure that cells can function optimally regardless of changes in the external environment, because the body attempts to maintain those internal conditions of temperature, pH, salinity, blood sugar, and so on within a narrow range. And that's, again, it's within a narrow range, right? It's not just a specific number. It's usually within a narrow range because there has to be some buffering or some buffer for changes in the external environment. So that was homeostasis. So now let's look at our next one. So what's number 4, right? So number 4, what did we say it was? It was the ability to harness energy. The ability to harness energy, right? Okay. So why is this necessary, and what do we mean by this? Well, again, this is one of those functions or one of those characteristics that aid in survival, right? Individual survival, I should say, survival of the individual. Okay. So why do we need energy? Well, so let's look at an example, right? So what happens when you don't eat food? Let's say you're used to eating 3 meals a day, and then one day you decide to fast, right? What's going to happen if you haven't eaten anything and your body is used to consuming energy, right, in the form of food? What's going to happen? You're going to get lethargic, or you're going to get tired, and you're going to get you're not going to get anything done that day, right? Because you're just tired because you don't have enough energy, and that's something that you don't want, right? So the reason that we have to have the ability to harness energy is that without energy, right? Without energy, we can't carry out our other 7 functions, right? So without having energy, if you don't have energy, you can't really do anything else, right? Except maybe order. Yeah, okay, order is just, I guess, genetic, right? Because it comes, it's already established when you're born, but everything else is pretty much dependent on the ability to use energy, right? Or at least the characteristics that are involved in survival of the individual, right? So energy is very important. Now, the sources of energy, the sources of energy will vary depending on the organism. Right? So for example, let's look at, again, humans as our first example. So our energy source is food, right? So how do we get energy from food? Well, the potential energy that is stored in the chemical bonds are the potential energy that's stored within the chemical bonds of food, right? So whether it be proteins, carbohydrates, and fats of the foods we consume is liberated during digestion and cellular respiration. All right, so these two processes allow us to harness the energy from food, right? And that energy comes in the form of stored potential energy that is stored within the chemical bonds of the foods that we consume. All right, so that's our energy source. So let's look at another organism, right? So let's look at plants. The energy source of plants is sunlight, right? Hence why, like we mentioned over here, that plants move towards the source of light because that's their energy source, right? And it makes sense for them to want to be closer to as close as possible as the energy source. So again, so sunlight is their source of energy. And so plants use sunlight to produce sugar, right, in the form of glucose, which is what we obviously consume as well, right? And the process that converts sunlight to sugar is known as photosynthesis. So as you can see, regardless of organism, there needs to be an energy source for it to be able to carry out the other 7 functions, and the energy source will vary depending upon the organism. For us, obviously, it's food. For plants, for example, it's sunlight. For bacteria, it could be you have cyanobacteria, which use sunlight as well, and then you can also have bacteria that consumes food, inorganic materials, and so on and so forth. So the source of energy can vary, but again, there needs to be the ability to harness energy in order for an organism to be living, right? And then last but not least, number 5, at least for part 1 of this video, or part 1 of lecture 1, is the ability to grow and develop. Okay, so again, this is another thing that aids in survival of the individual, right? And then by using the energy that we harness, and with help of our genes, organisms, and like us, organisms are able to undergo cellular growth and development, right? So they're able to undergo cellular growth and development, right? So that's important. So again, it goes to show once again that again, you need to be able to harness energy in order for you to really do anything, right? So for an organism to really partake in any of the other functions, it needs to be able to harness that energy. And then again, with the help of the genes that are present within the genetic code, within its DNA, then they're able to undergo cellular growth and development. And the other thing is also because genes play a role in growth, right? In growth and development, because the genetic code is sort of the roadmap, or not necessarily the roadmap, but well, yeah, I guess you could say it's the map to the individual, right? It's the directions to creating that individual organism. And so because these our genetics or our genes come from our parents, or any organism's genes comes from its parents, the individual is also able to exhibit many of the same characteristics as its parents. So as it grows, so again, as the organism grows, and develops, it'll exhibit many of the same features and characteristics as its parents, right? Because the genetic code comes from the parents, right? The parents give the whole part of reproduction is passing on those genes. And so by using the energy from the environment or from whatever source, and then using the genes that come along that have been given to the organism by the parents, it's then able to undergo cellular growth and development, and then ultimately it will exhibit many of the characteristics and the features of the parents themselves, because again, the genes came from the parents, right? The other big thing, and kind of our segue into part 2 of lecture 1, or the part 2 of lecture 1 video, is that growth and development also helps the organism reach reproductive maturation, right? By being able to grow and by being able to develop, you will ultimately reach the age, or the age at which the individual can then reproduce and then carry on the species and carry on the genes, right, to the next generation. And that we'll get to. When we get to that, we'll talk about those were let's see, where was that? These 3 other characteristics which aid in species survival, we'll get to in part 2 of lecture 1 video. So it will be the next video in this series. So hopefully you guys learned something today. And again, this is just an overview of kind of what to expect in terms of Biology 101 and lecture series. We'll go from, so let's talk about, this will be like kind of lecture 2, right? So not lecture 1, but lecture 2. So we'll start with kind of we'll start with the atom, and then sort of, this is also how like your traditional biology course progresses, right? So you'll start with the atom, and then make your way into the macromolecules, and then finally to the cell, and then you get bigger into the tissues and the organs, and then the organ systems, and then obviously finish off with the individual. So that's the trajectory of most, or the roadmap of most Biology 101 courses, and also what I plan to follow when making the Biology 101 lecture series, or videos. So hopefully you guys, again, like I said, you guys learned something, and if you did, or if you didn't, drop a comment, if anything, because I'd love to hear from you guys. And then because we're just starting the channel, right? So any feedback would be appreciated. as well. So I guess that's it for this one. Again, thank you guys for watching. And as always, stay true, be kind, never stop learning. And that's it. Okay, bye.